Welcome back to episode 3 of Austin Reads His Bookmarks. I was just listening to a beautiful Enya song, and it made me sad. With streaming, I'm realizing that it's pretty difficult to incorporate music, so still working on that intro. We'll see what's available. Also, I'll be getting a new mic and camera and things like that soon. I just got recommendations from a professional friend, so I've got a good setup coming, hopefully. The broad theme today is going to be socialism on the right, because I got hit by like 4 or 5 posts in a day a week ago, all kind of different examples of the various ways in which the right can be socialist, and it's specifically the new right, because the old right is socialist in all the basic ways we're familiar with. They're kind of largely responsible for the mess in the traditional sense of the unit party or progressives driving the speed limit. There's a lot of battles over those traditional conservative views that are really just progressive, but not all of the new right is untangling all of those myths as effectively as we could. So we'll start with this one from Martyrmade, Daryl Cooper, and I have another one from him up top, which he interacted with a little bit. So there's definitely some positive notes to this story, but basically he's saying horseshoe theory is, and we can zoom in on it for you guys. Horseshoe theory is basically that right-wingers eventually realized nationalism means taking care of your people instead of leaving them to unfettered competition. And left-wingers realizing you have to take care of your people before you can help anybody else. So that would be, instead of spending money on the military or abroad, then we would be spending that on building bridges or healthcare or something, which is a basic point that we've heard for ages. Why are we wasting money on military when it could be spent on our people? Which is it's an easier argument to make sometimes than why are we spending so much on military or NGOs? We should let people keep their money. If you say that we should give the people government benefits, it's an easy sell, and it's still considered acceptable because benefits are better than spending on killing people. So it's not a bad rhetorical step, but ultimately we don't want socialism in the US, not accounting for existing dependencies. And then the earlier part, the unfettered competition, is what is the more interesting framing, because if you take it in, basically it's that those semantics of that narratively fit into the left-wing idea that free trade and free markets led to the erosion of our manufacturing base. And there's some problems with that, because when you dig into the specific things, okay, so normally that's in the context of labor, right? Cheap foreign labor. That's probably the most common semantic interpretation of unfettered competition. That and tariffs. So the tariffs I'm fine with, and it's not as crazy it's not really a departure from free market economics in the way people think it is, because we're already taxed, or we already spend a huge amount, and real taxation is defined by spending. So during the Great Depression, tariffs went up from tariffs get a lot of attention in that story, and they went up, but they went up massively to fund an increase in federal spending from 3% to 9%. So those tariffs were indeed, and it did indeed represent additional taxes. Whereas today, government spending has stayed consistent around 24%. So when you're increasing the tariffs, we're not increasing government spending. That is steady as a percent of GDP. All the tariffs are doing are cutting into other tax rates. So that gets rid of some of the nuance there. But the other unfettered competition people normally think of is labor. And as I've said on History 102 and some other places, labor as a percent of manufacturing revenue is competitive in the US relative to China. In China, it's about 8% of manufacturing revenue goes to labor. And in the US, it's about 11%. And that's been consistent for about 20 years. And it varies per industry, but not much. It's a pretty tight range. And that applies to both high-tech and low-tech industries. So things like both textiles and semiconductor manufacturing, you can be competitive with a developing country because you can produce shirts in more technologically efficient ways as well. And so obviously, having worked in site selection in Asia, as I've mentioned also in other places, site selection is when you survey various locations, cities, countries, and you analyze the regulatory environment, the tax environment, the industry hubs, and you help companies find the correct city to relocate to. And almost all of the drivers of that relocation in terms of costs are regulatory, because regulations, a difference in taxes, say if your taxes are 5% lower than another country, that's a 5% difference. But regulations can double, triple, quadruple the cost of endeavors. Not only that, but they can quadruple the timeline. In some cases, it's actually cheaper to set up a business in the US than move the whole operation over to Asia. But if you try to do that, it'll take 5 years. While if you go to Asia at a higher price, it'll take 1 year to get set up. And then you're not missing out on 4 years of market share. So it can be worth spending more to build fast to get more years of market share. So, and that's obviously not the case every time, but it kind of highlights these factors. And what people don't understand about manufacturing and agriculture is, of course, there will be, trade specialization, comparative advantages, but all else equal, as knowledge of manufacturing increases, to knowledge of known innovations and new industries and new innovations, it'll always be an advantage. But as you're incorporating the already created innovation, all else equal, manufacturing and agriculture is going to go increasingly localized because you're cutting out the transportation cost. And if people don't think the transportation cost is a big deal, it's 3 times higher than the labor difference. It's 10% of manufacturing revenue to ship something from Asia to the US. 3% difference in labor, 10% in shipping. So that's good news, because it's kind of it's the opposite conception people get of free trade. And then the other semantic element of free trade is people often refer to free trade agreements as free trade, but free trade agreements are the international standardization of taxes and regulations according to larger trade blocks, basically like the EU was originally sold on the concept of a free trade agreement. But what it really means is that you're now kind of in this international agreement that is standardizing regulations and taxes across regions, which forms a cartel. And the more people they get in that cartel, then the less they have to worry about having their regulatory regimes or tax regimes undermined by a country having lower regulations and lower taxes, which, for example, the EU and China really do not want, because if the US gets rid of its regulations and lowers its taxes, then it puts huge pressure on China and Europe to do the same. And they don't want to do that because they control their oligarchy through their regulations, and they have bursting budgets on spending. So they don't want to lower their taxes either. So basically, I guess the core of it is, and I think I commented under here. Yeah, what does unfettered competition mean here? And I said, apparently it means adding so many taxes and regulations that it's impossible to do business in the US, then blaming it on cheap foreign labor. Even though that's not the reason that we offshored so aggressively. And so, yeah, those are the common semantic interpretations of this. So, like, while these two things can seem reasonable if applied to proper context, if you're reading it how most people read it, you're just getting National Socialism, which doesn't work because it's not going to, that would not bring back business and that would not help people, which is the kind of the implication of the post. All right, and then scrolling up to the next one. Oh yeah, so this is Keith Woods, who's an Irish commentator, I believe. Actually, definitely he is, because his name is Keith. And he is advocating for the EU in this post, arguing with Eva Vlaanderen Greenbroek, the Dutch farm hero, one of the heroes of that event, and free speech warrior in the Netherlands, is talking about a referendum and getting rid of the EU, which would be fantastic. I've been talking about how the EU would be a disaster forever, how it's going to fall apart inevitably because of the differences within the European countries are so extreme, and the unaccountability of the bureaucracy. I was warning about how it wasn't going to result in a free trade zone. It would just result in stronger bureaucracy that was even less accountable, which is now centralized in Brussels. I was living in Spain when they got rid of the peso for the euro, and I remember seashells became significantly more expensive to buy. It went from like a couple pesos to like a euro. They just kept it priced at one. It was ridiculous. But there's a lot of problems with the EU, and it's basically always been a right wing. It's right wing to not want the EU, and it was always the leftist arguing for expanded EU membership. Right, that was the whole context of Brexit, and Brexit being linked to Trump, and then historically, it's the same philosophy as international communism, globalism, all the WEF stuff. As I mentioned a second ago with the Daryl post, the key factor here are the international cartels. So these international organizations and international supranational organizations are a violation of individual sovereignty, and they're also the creation of these large cartels that take away your freedom. So the conservative position is less, in the US context, it's less federal power, or it's, even beyond that. In the European context, it's not too late for them to avoid a centralized government, and they're also even more different as a continent than America is as a country. Like, the differences within Europe are huge. I often talk about how large and underestimated the differences in America are, but Europe is even worse. And America is already kind of stuck with some of these systems. So it would be a disaster if Europe built them. But Keith, who's on the right, is arguing for the EU, which throughout the last 10 years, I was always arguing with left-wing people over this. And it seems a lot of those left-wing people dropped their woke views around, and progressive views around identity politics or cancel culture or something, but they still maintained a lot of leftist views. Like, you hear a lot of people on the right idealizing Napoleon or Bismarck now. These are traditionally leftist characters, in that they're for international expansion, centralization, empire versus decentralization, which is a classic conservative value. So there's Keithy. And then let's scroll up to the next one, which, okay, yeah, this is a classic. So usury. Usury has become a big buzzword, and there's kind of a Mott and Bailey going on where with the castle on the area we know where the villages or the houses has a bailey, which is a smaller wall and it's less protected, and then there's a motte, which is like a keep, which you can retreat to. And so people will do this thing where they have a position that's kind of extreme, and then when you challenge them on it, which is centered in the bailey, the town, and when you challenge it on them on it, they retreat to the motte or the castle. And with usury, the bailey is basically calling out usury as bad in general, implying that interest is bad in general. And then the motte, the retreat position, is that no, I'm just saying that excessive interest is bad, which is an easier position to hold. And so that's always the claim. So then I saw Oron posted this screenshot of a book with a quote from Aristotle saying that Aristotle explains why usury must be hated and why it's bad. So you're thinking, okay, does he mean excessive interest or just interest in general? And if you read the passage, what Aristotle was talking about is interest in general. He's talking about making money off of money as a general concept. That's how Aristotle is defining usury. Aristotle's not defining usury as excessive interest. And so basically, it's kind of exposing the fact that they are indeed going after interest as a general concept, at least rhetorically. And then the points I made here were that Aristotle also believed in slavery as a way to make money, which may be more natural than doing math, but it's not more moral or functional. Obviously, Aristotle has lots of valuable philosophy and great ideas, but you don't have to take his word for usury, which he probably didn't have the understanding for, considering it's connected to Christian ideas of individual rights. Abandoning usury was because with individual rights, there's no implication that the government has control over how you use your money. So the issue with usury historically and biblically is traditionally the landed nobility or the monarchy were the only source of loans. They were the ones accumulating capital and having control of the money, but they got that money through taxing people. And so if the person who is taxing all of your income is also charging you exorbitant rates for the use of your money, then that can rub people the wrong way. So it was always about the relationship with the duty of the monarch. And then when there was a rise of merchant activity and more private actors with the wealth to loan, then it became instantiated that loaning was not a violation of people's rights. Charging them interest was not a violation of people's rights because people have no right to your money. Giving people your money comes with both risk and opportunity cost. Both of those are costs that have to be factored in. And the Salamanca monks in the 14 or 1500s out of Spain, they made they clarified like the Christian justification for the use of interest. And that's why Christendom was so successful. And a lot of times the connotation is, well, if Muslims don't charge each other interest, and if Jews don't charge each other interest, then why are we charging each other interest? Especially if Jews don't charge each other interest, but they charge us interest, then why are we charging each other interest? That seems like a scam. The reality is that Jews do charge each other interest. Only the most strict Orthodox Jews even follow the rules on interest. And when they do, they come up with semantic workarounds, like they call it investments or fines, and those payoffs that they make up through their semantic workarounds end up matching market interest rates. And we don't have to do semantic workarounds like Jews or Muslims, because we've realized that loaning money is not a violation of, or that people don't have a right to your money, basically. And just like we've, don't have to slaughter animals, the halal way, or we don't have to get someone else to turn our lights on at Shabbat. Like, the whole idea that Christianity is somehow, it's like biblical to be against interest is it's a bastardization of Christianity. And Aristotle was not a Christian, so that's probably why he didn't get it, or that's a big part of it. And getting back to the nobility or the king having the money, another semantic context this is filtered through is the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve is not a private actor. Well, technically it is, but it's the source of the government financing. And so people think, we hate the Fed, we hate usury, we can connect those concepts. But the biggest problem with the Fed is that they're charging a below market interest rate. They're charging too low of an interest rate for easy capital, which, in the short term, if it's under Trump and we deregulate, whatever, but that has serious long-term problems that have specifically to do with not charging enough interest, not charging too much interest. So that's that post about summed up. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, so this was the other post I mentioned from Martyr Made, and they are good points. They are points that I often make to libertarians, which can be summarized in that not creating a Federal Reserve and not creating a welfare state and not creating a global empire is an entirely different challenge than dismantling them. Like, when the founders were talking about these things, it was in the context of preventing them. Now we already have them. So it's good to be aware that they're bad, but it's not as simple as saying they shouldn't exist. We actually have to come up with meaningful strategies for removing the dependencies that have been created around these welfare structures and security dependencies and all of that. So I commented on this. No, that's not. How do you see? There we go. Click on it. Now, if I click this, I can view quotes. And I should find mine there. Yep, there it is. So, yeah, I said Martyr Made correctly pointed that out. And then he also mentioned regulations in the post as something that was, let's see. Let's just read his post first. Okay, mistakes created by the ills of modern society, welfare subverting family, community help, regulations driving up business and causing collapse of communities. Amazing. Thank you. More people on the right need to be making this point, because it's central to not only understanding our problems, but some of the most accessible solutions for removing them. Because if you get rid of bureaucracy, then you don't have any starving seniors out on the street because they lost their social security. It's all gravy. All it's doing is upholding corporate advantage and raising prices. So there's not as much of a dependency around bureaucracy as there is around welfare or security. So that's great. And then Mises was right about almost everything. Great. Unless libertarians are hoping for a benign dictator to shepherd the country through the invariable difficult transition process, peoples whose lives are disrupted are not going to vote libertarian. And that's true. That's why Trump has the strategy that he has. That's why I've been talking about it in that context for years. And you can see what Daryl said is true by, say, Margaret Thatcher as an example, right? Or austerity only or austerity first politics, where you're just talking about spending and taxes, and you're not actually doing anything that's increasing the opportunity or increasing people's ability to take care of themselves absent that reduction in spending. So that is what I explained basically to Daryl in my quote of his post. Oops, there we go. A few quotes. Yes, so as I said, that's what I spoke to Trump about. One of the reasons Milei has been able to cut so much government is because he deregulated housing, as an example, and reduced rent 30% in a few months. That's a huge percent of people's income. That gives you way more room to cut into spending. So things like this open up opportunities. It's an evolution of austerity first. It works. Same case for empire, right? We've talked about this before, where when the Roman Empire transitioned, at first it was Rome taking over these areas, and then it was Roman armies and Roman uniforms doing the security for these areas. And then eventually it became locals in Roman uniforms doing the security. And then eventually they just took off the Roman uniforms because the dependency was already removed. So getting Europe to spend money on defense is the key to ending NATO someday. And that's how we erode these dependencies, and that's a focus. And Daryl liked my post, which I appreciated. I appreciated that he was talking about regulations more, which funnily enough, it was easier to get him to do it than most libertarians, because I don't know, I think we're attached to the semantic simplicity of describing the economic problems purely as connected to the Fed. And the Fed is corrupting influence with the money because it erodes your savings, and they funnel it into the major banks. So big players get it at lower interest rates than others. So there's plenty of issues with it, but it's just one tax among many. Also, it's a tax that we can off-right on. So the key issue being our spending burden. And it's one tax among many, and the only tax that we can off-right much of our inflation onto global dollar holders. None of these other countries, all of whom are inflating more than us, can off-right half their inflation on global dollar holders. So it's strategic advantage that's tied into a lot of our dependencies, as well as a corrupting poison. So let's see what else we got here. Oh yes, James Fishback. Yes, that was a brutal one. Do I have my post of it up top? Let's go to James Fishback. Okay, so James Fishback is this guy running for governor in Florida, and he's trying to primary Brian O'Donnell, I think, who's kind of being set up as I don't know, DeSantis' successor or Trump's pick. I don't know all their relationships to him, but anyways, That's what this guy's doing. So let's watch his clip.
The free market is a means to an end, not the end itself. If the free market was the goal, there'd be a slave auction happening in the parking lot right now. Actually, it's a free market. There's buyers, there's sellers, there's a product. The goal is not a free market. It's a free people. I can't let these niggas knock me off my pivot. God said.
So, I mean, I'm guessing you could see a lot of the problems with that. It starts off with this is a lot of these people. I don't know if a lot of these people even realize what they're doing or how revealing the way they talk about these issues are. It could be they don't know how left-wing they are, because these are just their understanding of things growing up in the culture was that slavery is basically it ties back to Marx's use of the term capitalism as kind of being defined by the use of capital in general. And capital is relevant across both unfree and unfree markets. Like, it just means using money. So when money's involved, it's associated with capitalism, aka free markets. So because people are buying slaves, then it's considered a market or free market. So when in reality, let's see if I can just go to my post here. I did it again. Okay, yes. Yeah, so this was my reply, and he actually engaged with this one too, which was funny in kind of a sheepish way. But it's a total historical inversion that is very commonly seen amongst the left. And it's ironic because the societies that pioneered free markets were the ones that ended slavery, which was a global historical norm, as Aristotle pointed out earlier. And the reason we ended slavery was the same reason we had free markets. The reasons we respected people's property rights and their right to trade and participate in the economy as they wanted to voluntarily is because we recognize their individual sovereignty and their individual rights. Enslaving someone is a violation of their individual rights, which means it's a violation of free markets, literally, definitionally. The only way that this is why the U.S. made slavery so particular to racism, because the only way that they could justify slavery in the U.S., considering these Christian revelations around individual rights, which has existed throughout the society, was to say that Black people were animals, essentially, and that because animals don't have the same rights as humans. So the only way they were able to semantically justify slavery in the context of believing in human rights was to say that Black people weren't human. So that contributed to like a specific racial attitude that was more hardcore than it otherwise would have been, ironically. So, like I said, we can leave the historical inversions to the progressives. And this guy is clearly a former leftist, and he's doing all sorts of kind of cheesy populist talking points around these kind of usury and all these other issues. I mean, he has a lot of leftist politics. I don't remember them in this case, but this is a perfectly good example. And what was his reply? It was under one of these other replies. See if I can find it quick. Oh yeah, this guy says, feel like the point of the clip is being missed with this argument. If our current, quote, free market is not advancing a free people, it should be adjusted, not endlessly touted as a good in itself. And okay, well, but then if you're saying that, but then you're advocating for socialist policies that don't help people, and then blaming the huge rise in socialism on quote unquote late stage capitalism without recognizing that the late stage capitalism is just increasing socialism, then I'm not all that impressed or confident that you're going to be able to free people. Free markets is a representation of people's literal recognition of people's rights. Ironically, they are the ones advocating for the enslavement of humanity by their rejection of free markets, which actually is perfectly consistent. And so James just replied yes to that, which I didn't bother engaging with because he's just trying to kind of weasel out of the implications that he's a leftist, which he is. And that yeah, all those posts came out within like a day of each other, I think. I started to record a show on it last week, but was interrupted. So some of this is old news, but it's all timelessly themed, as we'll see it come up again and again. So I think that's probably a good place to stop. Consistent theme for this episode. And Ruddy and I will be back tomorrow for History 102 after a short holiday season break. Might be not as much flow over Christmas as well. But hey, it's you can always check out the History 102 merch store if you're looking for any late gifts or if you're missing our logo. So, all right, I think that's it. Follow me at Ludwig Never Mises Austin Paget on X, and have a Merry Christmas.